You are listening to Miniature Masterpiece.
Chapter 1. On a January evening of the early 70s, the streets of New York were covered in a thick blanket of snow, and the cold wind whistled through the tall buildings. It was a January evening of the early 70s, and a group of fashionable New Yorkers had gathered at the opera. The ladies wore fur muffs and capes, while the gentlemen sported top hats and thick overcoats. Among the throng of people was Newland Archer, a young man of impeccable breeding and unimpeachable character. He had just become engaged to May Welland, a beautiful and innocent girl who belonged to one of New York's most respected families. As he sat in his box at the opera, Archer couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. He was on the cusp of a life that promised comfort, respectability, and stability. However, as the curtain fell on the first act, Archer's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of his cousin, the Countess Olenska. She had recently returned to New York after leaving her European husband, and her scandalous behavior had made her the talk of the town. As the Countess entered his box, Archer couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He was drawn to her unconventional spirit and her air of sophistication, but he knew that associating with her could jeopardize his engagement to May. Nevertheless, as they sat together, Archer found himself increasingly captivated by the Countess's beauty and intelligence. As the opera drew to a close, Archer escorted the Countess to her carriage. It was then that she confided in him, revealing the depths of her unhappiness and her longing for a life free of societal constraints. Archer was struck by her vulnerability and her honesty, and he felt a deep connection with her that he had never experienced with anyone else. As he made his way back to his own carriage, Archer couldn't help but wonder what the future held for him. He was torn between his love for May, his duty to his family, and his desire for the Countess. He knew that his decision would have far-reaching consequences, but he also knew that he could never be truly happy unless he followed his heart. As the snow continued to fall and the streets of New York grew quieter, Archer pondered the choices that lay before him. It was a January evening of the early 70s, and the world was changing in ways that no one could have predicted. And as Archer contemplated his own future, he knew that he too would be swept up in the winds of change, whether he liked it or not. Chapter 2. The Age of Innocence. In the early days of New York society, the rules were simple and the boundaries were clear. The wealthy families of the city had a strict code of conduct, and any deviation from it was met with disapproval and ostracism. Newland Archer, like many of his peers, had been raised to adhere to this code. He knew the expectations that society had of him, and he took pride in his ability to meet them. He was well-educated, well-connected, and had the good sense to marry a suitable woman like May Welland. But as Archer became more familiar with the inner workings of New York society, he began to realize that the code was not as ironclad as he had thought. There were whispered rumors of infidelity, of secret affairs and hidden scandals. And as he spent more time with the Countess Olenska, Archer began to question the values and beliefs that had been instilled in him since birth. The Countess was unlike any woman he had ever known. She was free-spirited, intelligent, and unafraid to challenge the conventions of society. Her presence in New York had caused a stir, and many people viewed her with suspicion and disdain. But Archer was drawn to her, fascinated by her unconventional spirit and her willingness to live life on her own terms. As he sat with her in her drawing room, surrounded by books and works of art, Archer felt a sense of liberation. He was no longer bound by the strictures of society, and he was free to explore his own desires and ambitions. He began to see the world in a new light, realizing that the Age of Innocence was coming to an end. But as Archer's relationship with the Countess deepened, he also began to feel a sense of guilt. He was engaged to May Welland, a woman who embodied all the virtues of New York society. May was sweet, innocent, and devoted to him, and he knew that breaking off their engagement would cause her great pain. As Archer struggled to reconcile his conflicting emotions, he began to realize that the Age of Innocence was not just a historical period, but a state of mind. He saw that the world was changing, that the old certainties were giving way to new uncertainties, and that he would have to find his own way in this brave new world. And so, as he left the Countess's drawing room that evening, Archer knew that he was at a crossroads. He had to choose between the life that had been mapped out for him and the life that he truly wanted. The Age of Innocence was over, and the future was uncertain. But one thing was clear. Archer would never be the same again. Chapter 3. The Early Married Life of the Morels. Newland Archer's engagement to May Welland had been the talk of New York society. The two families were delighted by the match, and preparations for the wedding were underway. But as the wedding approached, Archer began to feel a sense of unease. He had grown increasingly close to the Countess Olenska, and he knew that his feelings for her were more than just a passing fancy. He was torn between his duty to his family and his desire for the Countess, and he knew that he could not go through with the wedding if he did not resolve his inner conflict. It was then that he received a letter from the Countess, informing him that she was planning to leave New York and return to Europe. Archer was devastated by the news, and he realized that he could not bear to lose her. He knew that he had to act quickly if he was to have any chance of being with her. Archer made the difficult decision to break off his engagement to May, even though he knew that it would cause her great pain. He knew that his actions would be seen as scandalous by New York society, and that he would be ostracized by his friends and family. But he also knew that he could not live a life of hypocrisy and deception, and that he had to follow his heart, no matter the consequences. As he navigated the fallout from his decision, Archer found solace in the company of the Countess. He realized that his love for her was genuine, and that he was willing to face any hardship to be with her. Together, they began to plan a future in which they could be together, free from the constraints of society. But their plans were soon thwarted by the arrival of the Countess's husband, who had come to New York to claim her. Archer was devastated by the news, and he realized that his dreams of a future with the Countess were over. He knew that he had to let her go, and he was filled with a sense of despair. In the months that followed, Archer tried to rebuild his life. He married May, and they began their life together as husband and wife. But he could not forget the Countess, and he knew that his love for her would always be a part of him. As he looked back on those early years of his marriage to May, Archer realized that his feelings for her had been genuine. He had come to love her for who she was, and he was grateful for the life they had built together. But he also knew that his love for the Countess had never truly died, and that he would always wonder what might have been. The early married life of the Morels had been marked by turmoil and uncertainty, but it had also been a time of great growth and self-discovery. As Archer looked back on those years, he knew that he had lived through a period of great change, both in his own life and in the world around him. The Age of Innocence was over, and he had been forever changed by it. Chapter 4. The Countess Olenska. The arrival of the Countess Olenska had caused a stir in New York society. Her European manners and unconventional behavior had made her the talk of the town, and many people viewed her with suspicion and disapproval. But Newland Archer saw something different in the Countess. He saw a woman who was brave enough to challenge the conventions of society, and who was unafraid to be herself, no matter the cost. He was drawn to her intelligence, her wit, and her beauty, and he felt a connection with her that he had never felt with anyone else. As Archer's feelings for the Countess deepened, he began to realize the true extent of her unhappiness. He learned that she had left her husband, a wealthy European aristocrat, because of his infidelities and his disregard for her feelings. She had come to New York in search of a new life, hoping to find a sense of freedom and independence that had been denied to her in Europe. But the Countess's past soon caught up with her. Her husband arrived in New York, determined to reclaim her and bring her back to Europe. The Countess was torn between her desire for freedom and her duty to her family, and she turned to Archer for help. Archer was conflicted. He knew that his involvement with the Countess could jeopardize his engagement to May Welland, a woman he had known since childhood and whom he was expected to marry. But he also knew that he could not turn his back on the Countess, and that he had to help her in any way he could. Together, Archer and the Countess plotted her escape from New York. They arranged for her to board a ship bound for Europe, and they made plans to meet again once she was safely out of the country. But their plans were soon discovered, and the Countess was forced to abandon her escape. She was reconciled with her husband, and Archer was left to wonder what might have been. In the aftermath of the failed escape, Archer's feelings for the Countess deepened even further. He realized that he was willing to risk everything for her, even if it meant defying the expectations of society and facing the disapproval of his friends and family. As he looked back on his time with the Countess, Archer knew that she had changed him forever. She had shown him that there was a world beyond the confines of New York society, and that true love was worth any sacrifice. And even though he had lost her, he knew that his love for her would always be a part of him. The Countess Olenska had left an indelible mark on his heart, and he would never forget her. Chapter 5. Archer's Engagement. Newland Archer's engagement to May Welland had been the talk of New York society. The two families were delighted by the match, and preparations for the wedding were underway. Archer had known May since childhood, and he had always admired her sweetness, her innocence, and her devotion to family. He knew that she was the ideal wife for a man of his station, and he was proud to be marrying her. But as the wedding approached, Archer began to feel a sense of unease. He had grown increasingly close to the Countess Olenska, and he knew that his feelings for her were more than just a passing fancy. He was torn between his duty to his family and his desire for the Countess, and he knew that he could not go through with the wedding if he did not resolve his inner conflict. It was then that he received a letter from the Countess, informing him that she was planning to leave New York and return to Europe. Archer was devastated by the news, and he realized that he could not bear to lose her. He knew that he had to act quickly if he was to have any chance of being with her. Archer made the difficult decision to break off his engagement to May, even though he knew that it would cause her great pain. He knew that his actions would be seen as scandalous by New York society, and that he would be ostracized by his friends and family. But he also knew that he could not live a life of hypocrisy and deception, and that he had to follow his heart, no matter the consequences. As he navigated the fallout from his decision, Archer found solace in the company of the Countess. He realized that his love for her was genuine, and that he was willing to face any hardship to be with her. Together, they began to plan a future in which they could be together, free from the constraints of society. But their plans were soon thwarted by the arrival of the Countess's husband, who had come to New York to claim her. Archer was devastated by the news, and he realized that his dreams of a future with the Countess were over. He knew that he had to let her go, and he was filled with a sense of despair. In the months that followed, Archer tried to rebuild his life. He married May, and they began their life together as husband and wife. But he could not forget the Countess, and he knew that his love for her would always be a part of him. As he looked back on those early years of his marriage to May, Archer realized that his feelings for her had been genuine. He had come to love her for who she was, and he was grateful for the life they had built together. But he also knew that his love for the Countess had never truly died, and that he would always wonder what might have been. Archer's engagement to May had been a turning point in his life. It had forced him to confront his deepest desires and his greatest fears, and it had led him on a path of self-discovery and self-realization. And even though he had chosen a life of stability and conventionality, he knew that his heart would always yearn for the freedom and passion that he had glimpsed in the Chapter 6. It was a crowded night at Wallack's theater. The theater was always a popular destination for New York society, and on this particular night, Wallack's theater was particularly crowded. Newland Archer had arrived with his fiancée, May Welland, and he had settled into his seat, ready for the evening's entertainment. But as the play began, Archer found himself distracted by the presence of Julius Beaufort in the audience. Beaufort was a man whom Archer had long mistrusted, and he could not help but feel uneasy in his presence. As the play continued, Archer found himself increasingly drawn to the Countess Olenska, who was seated in the box next to Beaufort. He could sense the tension between the two of them, and he knew that there was a history between them that he did not fully understand. Archer was torn between his loyalty to May and his growing fascination with the Countess. He knew that his involvement with the Countess could have serious repercussions, both for himself and for May. But he also knew that he could not resist the pull of his feelings for her. As the play ended, Archer found himself alone with the Countess in the lobby of the theater. They spoke briefly, and Archer could sense the depth of her unhappiness and her longing for a life that was more authentic and fulfilling. Archer knew that he was powerless to help the Countess, but he could not help but feel drawn to her. He knew that he was risking everything by becoming involved with her, but he also knew that he could not resist the pull of his own desires. As he made his way back to May, Archer realized that he was on the brink of a life-altering decision. He knew that he had to choose between his duty to his family and his own happiness, and he knew that the consequences of his decision would be far-reaching. Archer had always been a man of duty and convention, but he could feel the stirrings of something new and exciting within him. He knew that his involvement with the Countess was dangerous and scandalous, but he could not help but feel that it was also the beginning of a new and more meaningful life. As he settled back into his seat next to May, Archer knew that his world was about to change forever. He had been living in a world of privilege and conventionality, but he could sense that a new and more exciting life was waiting for him, just beyond the edge of his vision. Chapter 7. At the punctual age of 15. At the punctual age of 15, May Welland had made her debut into New York society. She was the embodiment of everything that was expected of a young woman of her station. Beautiful, well-mannered, and devoted to family. As the daughter of one of the city's most respected families, May had been carefully groomed for a life of privilege and conventionality. She had been taught to value the traditions of New York society and to uphold the expectations of her family and her class. When she met Newland Archer, May knew that he was the man she was meant to marry. He was handsome, well-connected, and from a family that was highly respected in New York society. May could sense that he shared her values and her ambitions, and she knew that he was the perfect match for her. As they courted, May and Archer became increasingly devoted to each other. They spent their days attending social events and discussing their hopes and dreams for the future. May knew that she had found the man she was meant to spend her life with, and she was filled with a sense of contentment and fulfillment. But as their engagement progressed, May began to sense that Archer was becoming increasingly distant. She could sense that he was struggling with something, but she could not quite put her finger on what it was. May was torn between her love for Archer and her loyalty to the traditions of New York society. She knew that she was expected to marry a man of Archer's standing, and she knew that their engagement was the result of careful calculation and planning. But she also knew that she loved Archer deeply, and that she could not bear the thought of losing him. As their wedding day approached, May realized that she had to confront Archer about his feelings. She knew that she had to get to the bottom of his uncertainty, and she was determined to find a way to make their engagement work. In the end, May's loyalty to New York society and her devotion to Archer won out. She confronted him about his feelings, and she was able to convince him that they were meant to be together. As they stood before the altar, May felt a sense of peace and contentment wash over her. She knew that she had made the right choice, and that she and Archer would build a life together that was filled with love and respect. May had always known that her life was predetermined by the expectations of New York society, but she had also known that she had the power to shape her own destiny. And as she stood next to Archer, she knew that she had made the right choice and that her future was bright and full of promise. Chapter 8. They entered the Van der Luyden drawing room. The Van der Luyden family was one of the most respected and influential families in New York society, and their drawing room was the site of some of the city's most exclusive social events. As Newland Archer and his fiancée, May Welland, entered the Van der Luyden drawing room, they knew that they were in the presence of some of the city's most important and powerful people. They had been invited to a dinner party in honor of the Duke of St. Austria, and they were both eager to make a good impression. The room was filled with the cream of New York society, and Archer and May were introduced to a dizzying array of aristocrats, bankers, and industrialists. They exchanged polite conversation and made small talk, all the while aware of the intense scrutiny of the other guests. As the dinner progressed, Archer found himself increasingly drawn to the Countess Olenska, who was seated at the opposite end of the table. He could sense the tension between her and the other guests, and he could not help but feel that she was out of place in this world of privilege and conventionality. Archer was torn between his loyalty to May and his growing fascination with the Countess. He knew that his involvement with the Countess could have serious repercussions, both for himself and for May. But he also knew that he could not resist the pull of his feelings for her. As the dinner party came to a close, Archer found himself alone with the Countess in the Van der Luyden drawing room. They spoke briefly, and Archer could sense the depth of her unhappiness and her longing for a life that was more authentic and fulfilling. Archer knew that he was powerless to help the Countess, but he could not help but feel drawn to her. He knew that he was risking everything by becoming involved with her, but he also knew that he could not resist the pull of his own desires. As he made his way back to May, Archer realized that he was on the brink of a life-altering decision. He knew that he had to choose between his duty to his family and his own happiness, and he knew that the consequences of his decision would be far-reaching. The Van der Luyden drawing room represented everything that was expected of New York society, but Archer could feel the stirrings of something new and exciting within him. He knew that his involvement with the Countess was dangerous and scandalous, but he could not help but feel that it was also the beginning of a new and more meaningful life. As he settled back into his seat next to May, Archer knew that his world was about to change forever. He had been living in a world of privilege and conventionality, but he could sense that a new and more exciting life was waiting for him, just beyond the edge of his vision. Chapter 9. From that evening on, Newland Archer's thoughts were consumed with the Countess Olenska. He could not shake the feeling that she was the one person who truly understood him and his desires. Despite his love for May, Archer could not help but feel drawn to the Countess. He knew that their involvement could have serious repercussions, but he could not resist the pull of his own desires. As he spent more time with the Countess, Archer began to see the world in a new light. He could sense the emptiness and shallowness of New York society, and he could not help but feel that there was something more authentic and meaningful waiting for him just beyond the edge of his vision. Archer knew that he was risking everything by becoming involved with the Countess, but he could not help but feel that their relationship was the beginning of a new and more fulfilling life. He began to see the world with fresh eyes, and he could sense the potential for new experiences and adventures. But Archer's involvement with the Countess was not without consequences. He could sense the disapproval of his family and his peers, and he could see the potential for scandal and ruin. He knew that his actions could have far-reaching consequences, both for himself and for the people he loved. As he struggled with his feelings, Archer knew that he had to make a decision about his future. He knew that he could not continue living in the shadow of conventionality and conformity, but he also knew that the consequences of breaking with tradition could be severe. Archer found himself torn between his love for May and his growing fascination with the Countess. He knew that he could not have both, and he knew that he had to make a choice that would have far-reaching consequences. From that evening on, Newland Archer's life was forever changed. He had been living in a world of privilege and conventionality, but he could sense that a new and more exciting life was waiting for him just beyond the edge of his vision. He knew that he was risking everything by becoming involved with the Countess, but he could not help but feel that their relationship was the beginning of a new and more meaningful life. Chapter 10. After a week in New York. After a week in New York, Newland Archer was consumed with thoughts of the Countess Olenska. He knew that he could not continue living in the shadow of conventionality and conformity, and he knew that he had to make a decision about his future. As he walked through the streets of New York, Archer could sense the emptiness and shallowness of the world around him. He could feel the pull of his own desires, and he could not help but feel that there was something more authentic and meaningful waiting for him just beyond the edge of his vision. Archer knew that he was risking everything by becoming involved with the Countess, but he could not help but feel that their relationship was the beginning of a new and more fulfilling life. He began to see the world with fresh eyes, and he could sense the potential for new experiences and adventures. Despite his love for May, Archer could not help but feel drawn to the Countess. He knew that their involvement could have serious repercussions, but he could not resist the pull of his own desires. As he struggled with his feelings, Archer knew that he had to make a decision about his future. He knew that he could not continue living a life of conformity and conventionality, but he also knew that the consequences of breaking with tradition could be severe. Archer found himself torn between his love for May and his growing fascination with the Countess. He knew that he could not have both, and he knew that he had to make a choice that would have far-reaching consequences. As he weighed his options, Archer realized that he had to be true to himself, no matter what the consequences. He could sense the potential for a new and more fulfilling life, and he could not resist the pull of his own desires. After a week in New York, Newland Archer was consumed with thoughts of the Countess Olenska. He knew that his involvement with her could have serious repercussions, but he could not help but feel that their relationship was the beginning of a new and more meaningful life. He knew that he was risking everything, but he also knew that he could not continue living in the shadow of conventionality and conformity. Chapter 11. It was a dull day. It was a dull day when Newland Archer received a letter from the Countess Olenska. In it, she expressed her desire to see him and to talk about their relationship. Archer knew that their involvement was risky, but he could not help but feel drawn to the Countess and her unconventional spirit. As he made his way to the Countess's home, Archer could feel the weight of his actions. He knew that his involvement with the Countess could have serious repercussions, both for himself and for the people he loved. But he could not resist the pull of his own desires, and he knew that he had to see the Countess, no matter the cost. When Archer arrived at the Countess's home, he was struck by the air of melancholy that surrounded her. He could sense the weight of her past and the toll that it had taken on her. But he could also sense her strength and her determination to live life on her own terms. As they talked, Archer realized that the Countess was not the delicate flower that he had once thought her to be. She was a strong and independent woman, determined to live life on her own terms, no matter the cost. Despite his love for May, Archer could not help but feel drawn to the Countess and her unconventional spirit. He knew that their involvement was risky, but he could not resist the pull of his own desires. As he left the Countess's home, Archer knew that his involvement with her could have serious repercussions. But he also knew that he could not continue living in the shadow of conventionality and conformity. He had to be true to himself, no matter the cost. It was a dull day when Newland Archer received the Countess's letter, but it was also the beginning of a new and more fulfilling life. Archer could sense the potential for new experiences and adventures, and he knew that he had to follow his own path, no matter where it might lead. Chapter 12. Mrs. Archer had been born a Newland. Mrs. Archer had been born a Newland, and as such, she was deeply invested in the conventions and traditions of New York society. She had spent her entire life striving to maintain the status quo, and she was determined to pass on this legacy to her son. As Archer's involvement with the Countess Olenska became more apparent, Mrs. Archer became increasingly concerned. She knew that their relationship could have serious repercussions, both for her son's reputation and for the family's standing in society. Despite her concerns, Mrs. Archer could not help but feel drawn to the Countess's unconventional spirit. She admired her strength and determination, and she could sense the potential for a new and more fulfilling life. As she struggled with her conflicting emotions, Mrs. Archer knew that she had to take action. She could not allow her son to throw away his future for the sake of a woman who was clearly not a part of their world. Mrs. Archer turned to her friend Mrs. Manson Mingott for advice. Mrs. Mingott was a powerful figure in New York society, and she had the influence and connections to help Mrs. Archer in her quest to save her son. Together, the two women came up with a plan to break up the relationship between Archer and the Countess. They knew that they had to act quickly before the scandal could do irreparable damage to the family's reputation. As they set their plan into motion, Mrs. Archer knew that she was taking a risk. She knew that her actions could have serious consequences, both for her son and for herself. Despite her concerns, Mrs. Archer was determined to do whatever it took to protect her son and the family's reputation. She knew that the conventions and traditions of New York society were too important to be disregarded, and she was willing to do whatever it took to uphold them. Mrs. Archer had been born a Newland, and as such, she was deeply invested in the traditions and conventions of New York society. She knew that her actions could have serious consequences, but she was determined to protect her son and uphold the legacy of her family. Chapter 13. There was no answer. Archer was desperate to see the Countess Olenska, but his attempts to contact her had been in vain. He had sent numerous letters and messages, but there was no response. As he struggled to understand the Countess's silence, Archer became increasingly frustrated and disillusioned. He could not understand why she was avoiding him, and he could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. Despite his growing unease, Archer could not help but feel drawn to the Countess and her unconventional spirit. He knew that their relationship was risky, but he could not resist the pull of his own desires. As he continued to wait for a response from the Countess, Archer began to question his own motives. Was he really in love with her, or was he simply drawn to her because she represented a break from the conventions and traditions of New York society? As these thoughts consumed him, Archer began to realize that his feelings for the Countess were more complicated than he had initially thought. He knew that their relationship was fraught with danger and risk, but he could not deny the pull of his own desires. As he struggled to make sense of his emotions, Archer received news that would change his life forever. May Welland, the woman he had been engaged to for so long, was pregnant. This news only added to Archer's confusion and frustration. He knew that he was expected to marry May and start a family, but he could not shake the feeling that his life was meant for something more. As he grappled with these conflicting emotions, Archer realized that he was at a crossroads. He could either continue down the path that had been laid out for him, or he could follow his own desires, no matter the cost. Despite the uncertainty and risk, Archer knew that he could not deny the pull of his own desires. He was drawn to the Countess and her unconventional spirit, and he knew that he could not continue living in the shadow of conventionality and conformity. As he made his decision, Archer knew that his life would never be the same. There was no answer from the Countess, but there was a new path before him, one that would lead him away from the conventions of New York society and into a new and more fulfilling life. Chapter 14. Mrs. Mingott had abetted her son. Mrs. Manson Mingott was a formidable figure in New York society, with the power and influence to shape the fate of those around her. When she learned of her grandson's desire to marry the Countess Olenska, she knew that she had to act quickly. Mrs. Mingott had always been fond of Ellen, and she could see the potential for a happy and fulfilling life for her grandson. However, she also knew that their relationship could have serious consequences, both for the family's reputation and for Archer's own happiness. Despite these concerns, Mrs. Mingott could not help but feel drawn to the Countess's unconventional spirit. She admired her strength and determination, and she could sense the potential for a new and more fulfilling life. As she struggled with her conflicting emotions, Mrs. Mingott knew that she had to take action. She could not allow her grandson to throw away his future for the sake of a woman who was clearly not a part of their world. Mrs. Mingott turned to her trusted confidant, Mrs. Archer, for help. Together, the two women came up with a plan to break up the relationship between Archer and the Countess. They knew that they had to act quickly before the scandal could do irreparable damage to the family's reputation. As they set their plan into motion, Mrs. Mingott knew that she was taking a risk. She knew that her actions could have serious consequences, both for her grandson and for herself. Despite her concerns, Mrs. Mingott was determined to do whatever it took to protect her grandson and the family's reputation. She knew that the conventions and traditions of New York society were too important to be disregarded, and she was willing to do whatever it took to uphold them. With Mrs. Archer's help, Mrs. Mingott was able to put a stop to Archer's relationship with the Countess. It was a difficult and painful decision, but one that Mrs. Mingott knew was necessary for the greater good. As she watched her grandson move on with his life, Mrs. Mingott could not help but feel a twinge of regret. She knew that the Countess had represented a break from the conventions of New York society, and she couldn't help but wonder what might have been if things had turned out differently. Despite these doubts, Mrs. Mingott knew that she had made the right decision. She had abetted her son and ensured that the family's reputation would remain intact. It was a small price to pay for the stability and security that came with a life lived in accordance with the conventions of New York society. Chapter 15. Newland Archer, leaning against. As Newland Archer leaned against the wall at the opera, he could feel the weight of his own unhappiness settling upon him. He had tried to bury his feelings for the Countess Olenska, but they had only grown stronger over time. Watching her from across the room, Archer could see that the Countess was also unhappy. He could see the sadness in her eyes, and he knew that he was the cause of her pain. Despite his feelings for Ellen, Archer knew that their relationship was impossible. He was bound by the conventions of New York society, and he knew that he could never be with her. He had to honor his commitment to May Welland, the woman he was engaged to marry. As the music swelled around him, Archer felt the weight of his own misery grow heavier. He knew that he was trapped in a life that he did not want, forced to live by rules that he did not believe in. But even as he wallowed in his own despair, Archer could not help but feel drawn to the Countess. He could see the potential for a life of excitement and adventure with her, a life that he could never have with May. As the opera ended, Archer watched as Ellen disappeared into the night. He knew that he would never be able to forget her, no matter how hard he tried. Returning home to his empty house, Archer was consumed by his own thoughts. He knew that he had a choice to make, a choice between the safe, predictable life that he had always known and the uncertain, thrilling life that he could have with the Countess. Despite his doubts and fears, Archer knew that he could not ignore his feelings for Ellen. He had to find a way to be with her, no matter what the cost. As he drifted off to sleep that night, Archer knew that his life would never be the same. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and he knew that he would have to face the consequences of his actions. But even as he lay there, consumed by his own doubts and fears, Archer knew that he had made the right decision. He had chosen to follow his heart, to take a chance on love, even if it meant risking everything he had ever known. Chapter 16. At the back of the Beaufort mansion. Newland Archer waited nervously in the back room of the Beaufort mansion, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come here to see the Countess Olenska, to confess his love for her and to beg her to run away with him. As he waited, Archer looked around the room, taking in the opulent furnishings and the expensive art on the walls. He knew that this was the world that Ellen had grown up in, a world of luxury and privilege that he could never truly understand. But despite his misgivings, Archer knew that he had to try. He had to convince Ellen to leave this world behind, to come with him into the unknown. Finally, Ellen appeared at the door, her eyes dark with emotion. Archer could see the pain and fear in her face, and he knew that he had to be gentle with her. Taking her hand, he led her out of the mansion and into the cool night air. They walked in silence for a time, until Ellen finally spoke. "I can't do this, Newland," she said softly. "I can't leave everything behind and run away with you. I wish I could, but I can't." Archer felt a pang of despair at her words, but he knew that he could not give up. He had come too far, risked too much, to let this opportunity slip away. "Please, Ellen," he said, his voice pleading. "We can go anywhere, do anything. We can start a new life together, away from all of this." Ellen looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. For a moment, Archer thought that she might give in, that she might agree to go with him. But then she shook her head, pulling her hand away from his. "I can't, Newland," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have too much to lose." With a heavy heart, Archer watched as Ellen turned and walked away. He knew that he had failed, that he would never be able to convince her to leave with him. But even as he stood there, consumed by his own sadness and regret, Archer knew that he would never forget the Countess Olenska. She had changed his life forever, and he knew that he would carry her memory with him always. Chapter 17. It was one of the great livery-stablemans. As Newland Archer walked through the city, his thoughts turned to the Countess Olenska once again. He couldn't get her out of his mind, even as he went about his daily routine. It was then that he saw one of the great livery-stableman's carriages approaching, driven by the same coachman who had taken Ellen away from the Beaufort mansion. Archer was filled with a sudden sense of urgency. He knew that he had to find out where Ellen was going, and he knew that this was his chance. He hailed the carriage and asked the coachman where he was taking the Countess. The coachman hesitated for a moment, but then gave Archer the address. Without a second thought, Archer jumped into a nearby hansom cab and instructed the driver to take him to the same address. He was determined to find Ellen and try once again to convince her to leave with him. When he arrived at the address, Archer saw that it was an old building, dilapidated and run down. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he had made a mistake. But then he saw Ellen, standing on the steps of the building. She looked surprised to see him, but also relieved. "Newland," she said, her voice soft. "What are you doing here?" Archer took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that this was his last chance, that he had to convince Ellen to leave with him now or lose her forever. "Please, Ellen," he said, his voice urgent. "Come with me. We can go anywhere, do anything. We can start a new life together." Ellen looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion. For a moment, Archer thought that she might agree, that she might finally see that they were meant to be together. But then she shook her head, pulling away from him. "I can't, Newland," she said, her voice filled with regret. "I have to stay here, where I belong." Archer felt a sense of despair wash over him, He knew that he had failed, that he would never be able to convince Ellen to leave with him. But even as he turned to walk away, he knew that he would never forget her. She had changed his life forever, and he knew that he would always carry a piece of her with him. Chapter 18. The next day at luncheon. The day after his encounter with Ellen, Newland Archer found himself at the Van der Luyden mansion for luncheon. He was in a daze, unable to focus on anything but his thoughts of Ellen. As he sat at the table, he heard the other guests discussing the news of the day. They talked of politics, of society scandals, and of the latest fashions. But Archer couldn't bring himself to join in. He felt like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong in this world. It was then that he noticed the Countess Olenska sitting across the table from him. He felt a surge of emotion, both joy and pain, as he looked at her. Ellen was dressed in a simple, elegant gown, and her hair was pulled back in a loose knot. She looked more beautiful than ever, and Archer felt a deep sense of longing. But he knew that he couldn't let his feelings show. He had to be careful, had to maintain his composure, even in the face of such temptation. As the meal continued, Archer found himself drawn into a conversation with Mrs. Welland. She was discussing her daughter May's upcoming wedding, and Archer tried to show an interest in the details. But his mind kept wandering back to Ellen, and he found himself barely paying attention to what was being said. Suddenly, he felt a hand on his arm. It was Ellen, looking at him with concern in her eyes. "Newland," she whispered, "are you all right? You seem so distracted." Archer felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He wanted to take Ellen in his arms, to tell her how he felt, but he knew that he couldn't. Instead, he forced a smile and nodded. "I'm fine, Ellen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just a little tired, that's all." Ellen looked at him for a moment longer, her eyes searching his face. But then she nodded and withdrew her hand. As the meal drew to a close, Archer felt a sense of relief. He knew that he couldn't keep up this charade much longer, that he had to find a way to be with Ellen, or else he would lose her forever. But for now, he would have to be content with stealing glances at her across the table, and with dreaming of a future that might never be. Chapter 19. The night before the ball. The night before the ball, Newland Archer had gone to bed thinking of May Welland. He had been restless and agitated, unable to shake the image of May's sweet face from his mind. But as he lay there in the darkness, he heard a sound that made him sit up in bed, the sound of someone tapping on his window. He got out of bed and went to the window, where he saw a figure standing in the shadows below. It was Olenska. She had come to see him, to ask him to help her escape from her unhappy life. Newland was torn between his duty to May and his desire for Ellen. He knew that if he helped her, he would be risking everything he had worked for. But he could not resist her plea for help, and he agreed to meet her the next day. The ball was a grand affair, with everyone dressed in their finest clothes. Newland was there with May, but he could not stop thinking about Ellen. He watched her from across the room, her dark beauty standing out against the sea of pale faces. As the night wore on, Newland found himself increasingly drawn to Ellen. They danced together, their bodies moving in perfect harmony. He knew that he was risking everything by being with her, but he could not help himself. Eventually, May noticed Newland's attention was elsewhere and asked him what was wrong. He lied and said he was feeling unwell, and they left the ball early. The next day, Newland met Ellen in secret and arranged for her to leave New York. He knew that he would never see her again, but he could not regret what he had done. He had acted on his heart, and he knew that it was the right thing to do. As he walked home that night, Newland thought about the choice he had made. He had sacrificed everything for a love that could never be. But in that moment, he knew that he would always remember Olenska as the one who had opened his heart to the true meaning of love. Chapter 20. It was the night before. It was the night before May's wedding, and Newland Archer was restless. He had been forced to make a decision that would forever alter his life, and the thought of it weighed heavily on him. He longed to be free of his obligations and escape with Ellen, but he knew it was impossible. He was bound by the rules of society and the expectations of his family. Newland decided to go for a walk, hoping it would clear his mind. As he walked through the empty streets of New York, he couldn't help but think about the past. He remembered his youthful dreams of breaking free from the constraints of society, of living a life of passion and excitement. But now, as he faced the consequences of his actions, he realized that those dreams were just that, dreams. He walked past the familiar brownstone where Ellen had lived, now empty and deserted. He couldn't help but feel a sense of loss and regret. He knew he had made the right decision to honor his commitment to May, but the thought of what could have been lingered in his mind. As he continued his walk, he came across a group of men standing outside a shop, smoking and chatting. They greeted him warmly, but he couldn't bring himself to engage in conversation. He felt disconnected from them, from their world of business and commerce. He walked on, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the empty streets. The city seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And in a way, Newland felt the same. He was waiting for the moment when he would have to face his new reality, the reality of a life without Ellen. As he walked back to his hotel, he knew he had to find a way to make peace with his decision. He couldn't continue to live with the constant regret and longing. He had to find a way to accept his life as it was, to find happiness and fulfillment in the world he had chosen. It was the night before May's wedding, and Newland Archer knew that his life was about to change forever. But he also knew that he had the strength and resilience to face whatever lay ahead, to make the most of the life he had been given. Chapter 21. The Departure of the American. The news of Olenska's departure from New York had reached Archer only that morning. As soon as he heard it, he resolved to see her before she left, but he had not counted on the difficulties that lay in his way. Ellen was staying with Mrs. Welland, and he knew that the family would be in attendance until the last moment. He decided to call on Mrs. Welland, hoping to find a way to speak with Ellen alone. When he arrived, he was informed that Mrs. Welland was receiving visitors in the drawing room. He was shown in and found himself among a group of elderly ladies, discussing the latest gossip of the day. As he waited for an opportunity to speak with Ellen, he felt a sense of frustration and impatience growing within him. Finally, the ladies began to depart, and Archer saw his chance. He approached Ellen, who was standing by the window, looking out over the snow-covered street. "Ellen," he said, "I just heard that you're leaving New York. I had to see you before you go." She turned to face him, and he was struck once again by her beauty. "Yes, I am leaving," she said. "I couldn't stay any longer." "I understand," he said, struggling to find the right words. "But I had to tell you. I love you, Ellen. I've loved you since the first moment I saw you. And I'll always love you, no matter where you go." Ellen looked at him with a mixture of sadness and regret. "Newland, you know that can never be," she said softly. "We both have obligations, responsibilities. We can't just throw them away." Archer felt a sense of desperation growing within him. "But what about us?" he asked. "Don't we have a chance? Can't we make a life together, away from all of this?" Ellen shook her head. "No, Newland," she said. "We can't. It's too late for us. We both made our choices long ago, and we have to live with them." Archer felt a sense of despair washing over him. He knew that Ellen was right, but he couldn't help feeling that they were both missing out on something wonderful. As he turned to leave, Ellen reached out and touched his arm. "Don't forget me, Newland," she said. "I'll always remember you." Chapter 22. The day was fading. As the day drew to a close, Newland Archer walked aimlessly through the streets of New York. He felt restless and agitated, unable to shake the memory of his encounter with Madame Olenska earlier that day. He had been surprised to find her waiting for him in his office, her eyes full of a desperate plea. She had begged him to help her escape her unhappy marriage and start a new life with him, but he knew that such a decision would be impossible for them both. As he walked, Archer found himself drawn to the familiar sights and sounds of his childhood neighborhood. The streets were quieter now, the crowds of people that had once filled them slowly dispersing as the day came to an end. He passed by the house where he had grown up, remembering the carefree days of his youth. But even as he reflected on these memories, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He knew that his life was no longer the same, that he had been forever changed by the events of the past few months. Archer's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a familiar voice calling his name. He turned to see May Welland standing on the corner, her face flushed with excitement. She told him that she had just received news that their wedding date had been moved up, and that they would be married in just a few weeks' time. Archer was taken aback by the suddenness of it all, but he knew that it was the right thing to do. As they walked back to May's house together, Archer couldn't help but feel a sense of resignation. He knew that his future with May was set, and that there was no turning back. But even as he accepted his fate, he couldn't help but think of Madame Olenska and wonder what might have been. The day had faded into evening by the time they reached May's house, and Archer was grateful for the darkness that obscured his face. He knew that his expression betrayed his inner turmoil, and he didn't want May to see it. As he said good night and walked away, Archer couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. He knew that his life was about to change irrevocably, and that he could never go back to the way things had been before. Chapter 23. Late that afternoon. As the day was drawing to a close, Newland Archer found himself on a street corner in the city, lost in thought. The news of May's pregnancy had hit him hard, and he couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a life he didn't truly want. As he stood there, a carriage passed by carrying none other than Olenska. He watched as she looked up and saw him, recognition and sadness crossing her face before the carriage moved on. Feeling a sudden urge to see her, Newland made his way to her house, only to be told by the butler that she was not at home. He walked away, feeling disappointed but also relieved at the same time. As he continued to walk, he found himself in a rougher part of town, where he saw a man who looked familiar. It was Julius Beaufort, the man who had once been shunned by society but was now back in its good graces. Newland watched as Beaufort went into a seedy-looking building and felt a wave of disgust and pity. As he walked away, he saw a young woman walking towards him, and to his surprise, realized it was Olenska. They walked together for a short distance, discussing her plans to leave New York and return to Europe. In that moment, Newland felt a sense of regret that he had not pursued a life with her when he had the chance. He also felt a sense of kinship with her, as they were both outsiders in a society that placed great emphasis on conformity. As they parted ways, Newland realized that his feelings for Ellen were deeper than he had ever allowed himself to acknowledge. He also realized that his marriage to May was not the only thing that was keeping him from pursuing a life with Ellen. Society's expectations and the pressure to conform were also playing a significant role. As he walked away, he knew that he had a difficult decision to make. Whether to stay in a life that was safe and predictable, or to take a risk and pursue a life with the woman he truly loved, even if it meant going against society's expectations. Late that afternoon, Newland Archer stood at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take. Chapter 24. It was the old New York way. As the engagement between May Welland and Newland Archer progressed, the couple began planning their wedding. May's mother, Mrs. Welland, took charge of the preparations, and Newland found himself being drawn into the old-fashioned traditions of New York high society. He was introduced to Mrs. Manson Mingott, May's formidable grandmother, who ruled over the family with an iron fist. Newland was surprised to find that Mrs. Mingott was sympathetic to his desire to travel to Europe with May after their wedding. She advised him to take a yacht instead of a steamer, as it would be more comfortable for May, who was delicate. Newland was impressed by Mrs. Mingott's practicality and admired her for her refusal to conform to society's expectations. As the wedding approached, Newland grew increasingly uneasy about the prospect of marriage. He began to question his feelings for May and wondered whether he had made a mistake in proposing to her. He was haunted by the memory of his brief affair with Countess Olenska and felt trapped by the conventions of society. At a dinner party, Newland was surprised to see the Countess Olenska in attendance. She was visiting New York from Washington and had been invited by Mrs. Welland as a courtesy. Newland was struck by how much he had missed her and was drawn to her once again. After the party, Newland walked home alone and reflected on the state of his life. He felt that he was trapped in a world that he no longer believed in and longed for something more meaningful. He thought about the Countess Olenska and the passion that he had felt for her, and realized that he could not go through with his marriage to May. The next day, Newland went to visit the Countess Olenska at her hotel. They spoke candidly about their feelings for each other and the constraints that society had placed upon them. The Countess Olenska was reluctant to pursue a relationship with Newland, as she did not want to be the cause of a scandal. Newland, however, was determined to be with her and asked her to run away with him. The Countess Olenska ultimately refused Newland's offer, as she did not want to ruin his reputation or her own. She realized that their love was impossible within the confines of society and urged Newland to honor his commitment to May. Newland reluctantly agreed and left the Countess Olenska, heartbroken. As the day of his wedding approached, Newland tried to put the Countess Olenska out of his mind and focus on his future with May. He knew, however, that he could never be truly happy in the old New York way, and longed for a life that was more authentic and true to his own desires. Chapter 25. The Day Drawing to Its Close. As the day was drawing to its close, Newland Archer walked towards the house in which he had been living since his marriage to May Welland. He was lost in thought, pondering on his situation and the complicated circumstances surrounding him. He had just come from the Countess Olenska's house, where he had gone to discuss the matter of her divorce. It was a difficult and delicate matter, but he had promised May that he would help her cousin, and he intended to keep his promise. Archer had always been fascinated by the Countess Olenska, and the more he got to know her, the more he was drawn to her. He admired her courage and independence, which were so different from the women he knew in his own social circle. But at the same time, he was troubled by the way she challenged his beliefs and values. He knew that he was expected to uphold the customs and traditions of his class, but he found himself increasingly questioning their relevance in the modern world. As he entered his house, he was greeted by the sight of his wife, May, who was waiting for him in the drawing room. She was dressed in a beautiful gown, and her hair was styled in an elegant coiffure. She smiled at him warmly, and he felt a pang of guilt for his thoughts about the Countess Olenska. May was the perfect wife, beautiful, sweet, and obedient, but he couldn't help feeling that there was something missing in their marriage. They talked for a while about their plans for the evening, and Archer suggested that they go to the opera. May agreed, and he felt a sense of relief that he had managed to distract her from the topic of the Countess Olenska. As they prepared to leave, he looked at her with a sense of longing and regret. He knew that he loved her, but he couldn't help wondering what his life would have been like if he had married someone like the Countess Olenska. As they made their way to the opera house, Archer couldn't help noticing the contrast between the glamorous world of the upper class and the gritty reality of the city around them. He felt a sense of unease, knowing that his privileged life was built on the suffering of others. He wondered if it was possible to live a moral and ethical life in such a world. The opera was a grand spectacle, and May was enraptured by the music and the costumes. But Archer found himself drifting off, lost in his thoughts once again. He knew that he had to make a decision about the Countess Olenska's divorce, and he dreaded the consequences of his actions. He felt trapped, torn between his duty to his wife and his desire for the Countess Olenska. As the opera ended, they made their way back to their house, but Archer couldn't shake off his feelings of doubt and despair. He knew that his life would never be the same again, and he wondered if he had made the right choices. As the day finally drew to a close, he realized that he was no longer innocent, and that he had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. Chapter 26. When the young women rose. The New York society was thrilled with the news of Countess Olenska's intention to divorce her husband, who had disappeared from her life soon after their marriage. People whispered that the Count had been mentally unstable and that the Countess had long been unhappy with him. The rumors were further fueled by the fact that the Countess had been seen in the company of Newland Archer, a married man. Society speculated on the possibility of a future between the two. As the divorce proceedings progressed, the Countess remained secluded in her house, and her relatives refrained from visiting here. Meanwhile, Archer was consumed with thoughts of her and could hardly contain his desire to see her. When he finally received a message from the Countess inviting him to visit her, he was overjoyed. On the day of the appointment, Archer arrived at the Countess's house and was led into her sitting room, where he found her sitting by the fire, dressed in a flowing white gown. She was a vision of ethereal beauty, and Archer was struck by her charm and elegance. As they talked, Archer began to realize the depth of the Countess's intelligence and sensitivity. He became acutely aware of the restrictions that society had imposed on her, and of the painful sacrifices she had made to conform to its norms. He felt a deep sense of empathy for her, and his admiration for her grew with each passing moment. As the conversation progressed, Archer began to feel an overwhelming desire to confess his love for the Countess. He struggled to suppress his feelings, but as the visit came to an end, he finally blurted out his true feelings. The Countess was taken aback, but she did not reject him outright. Archer left the house feeling conflicted and confused. He knew that he loved the Countess, but he was also aware of the repercussions of pursuing a relationship with a woman who was seeking a divorce. He struggled to reconcile his desire for the Countess with his sense of duty towards his wife and his obligations to society. As he walked through the streets of New York, Archer was haunted by the memory of the Countess's beauty and grace. He longed to be with her but knew that doing so would mean defying the strict rules of society. He was torn between his love for her and his allegiance to the world he had always known. Chapter 27. The next day at noon. The next day at noon, Newland Archer was hurrying along Madison Avenue towards the office of his legal advisor. He had just received a telegram informing him that his firm's senior partner, Mr. Letter Blair, wished to see him immediately. Archer had a feeling that this summons was connected with Ellen Olenska's departure, and he dreaded the interview, though he could not have explained why. As he walked, his mind was in turmoil. He thought of Ellen's sudden departure, the way she had said goodbye to him so hurriedly, and the fear that he might never see her again. He thought of his own situation, his unhappy marriage to May Welland, and the suffocating constraints of society that prevented him from being with the one person he truly loved. Finally, he arrived at Mr. Letter Blair's office and was shown into the senior partner's private room. Mr. Letter Blair greeted him with an air of grave concern and informed him that a matter had arisen that required his immediate attention. He then proceeded to tell Archer that the Countess Olenska had decided to sue for divorce from her husband, and that she had appointed him as her legal representative. Archer was stunned. He had not expected this news and was uncertain how to react. He knew that divorce was a scandalous affair in their social circle and could not imagine the impact it would have on his own life. However, he also felt a sense of relief that Ellen had taken this decisive step, as it seemed to signal the possibility of a future together. Mr. Letterblair went on to explain that, in light of the Countess's decision, it was imperative that Archer take steps to ensure that his own name was not implicated in any way. He urged Archer to distance himself from Ellen and to make it clear to society that he had no involvement in the matter. Archer listened to Mr. Letterblair's advice, but his mind was elsewhere. He could not shake the image of Ellen Olenska, alone and vulnerable in her struggle for independence. He knew that he still loved her, and that he could not simply turn his back on her in her hour of need. As he left Mr. Letterblair's office and walked out into the bustling street, Archer felt torn between his loyalty to May and his desire for Ellen. He knew that he must make a choice, but he could not bring himself to do so just yet. For now, he could only think of Ellen and of the pain and loneliness she must be feeling at that very moment. Chapter 28. All That May. May Welland was a vision of grace and beauty as she walked down the aisle on her wedding day, accompanied by her father and attended by her bridesmaids. The ceremony took place in the magnificent Fifth Avenue church, and it seemed as if all of New York had gathered to witness the event. Newland Archer, the groom, stood waiting nervously at the altar, his thoughts consumed by memories of his forbidden love for May's cousin, the Countess Olenska. But as he gazed upon May in her bridal finery, he felt a surge of affection and admiration for her. The couple exchanged their vows, and the ceremony was followed by a grand reception at the Wellands' mansion. The house was filled with guests, including the Van der Luydens, the Mingotts, and the Beauforts, all of whom were eager to congratulate the newlyweds. As the evening wore on, Newland found himself increasingly drawn to the Countess Olenska, who was also in attendance. He couldn't help but feel a pang of regret as he watched her dance with other men, knowing that they could never be together. Despite his inner turmoil, Newland remained committed to his new wife and did his best to put his feelings for the Countess behind him. He and May departed on their honeymoon, traveling to the Adirondack Mountains to enjoy the natural beauty of the region. During their time in the mountains, Newland and May grew closer, enjoying long walks in the woods and intimate conversations by the fire. May proved to be a devoted and loving wife, and Newland was grateful for her presence in his life. But even as he basked in the happiness of his new marriage, Newland couldn't shake the memory of the Countess Olenska from his mind. He knew that their paths would continue to cross, and he couldn't help but wonder what the future held for them. As May and Newland returned to New York and settled into their new life together, the city seemed to come alive with the arrival of spring. The trees were in bloom, the air was warm and fragrant, and it felt as if anything was possible. For Newland, however, the future was uncertain. He knew that he had made a commitment to May, but he couldn't help but wonder what might have been if he had followed his heart instead of his duty. As he gazed out at the bustling streets of New York, he couldn't help but feel a sense of longing for the freedom and passion he had once known. Chapter 29. When he awoke. When Newland Archer woke, he found himself in his own bed. At first, he thought he had dreamt the previous night's events, but he quickly realized that it was all real. He had indeed told May everything about his love for Ellen Olenska, and she had released him from their engagement. Newland felt a sense of liberation, yet also a profound sadness. He had loved May in his own way, and he knew that she had loved him deeply. He wondered what her future would be like, and if she would be happy. As he lay there, Newland thought about Ellen and how he longed to see her again. He wondered if she would ever forgive him for not running away with her. He knew that his life would never be the same again, but he was determined to try and make the best of it. After some time, Newland got up and dressed. He went to his study and sat down at his desk. He saw a letter lying there, and he recognized Ellen's handwriting. He eagerly opened it and read it. In the letter, Ellen thanked him for his honesty and expressed her sympathy for his pain. She wrote that she was leaving New York and returning to Europe, and that she would always remember their time together fondly. Newland was filled with a sense of loss as he read the letter. He realized that Ellen was truly gone from his life now, and that he would never see her again. He felt a sense of regret that he had not gone with her when he had the chance, but he knew that it was too late now. As he sat there, lost in thought, Newland heard a knock at his door. It was his son Dallas, who had come to visit him. Dallas was full of news about his own life, and he talked excitedly about his upcoming wedding. Newland listened patiently, but his mind was elsewhere. As Dallas was leaving, he noticed the letter from Ellen lying on the desk. He picked it up and read it, and then looked at his father with concern. Newland told him about what had happened, and Dallas listened sympathetically. As Newland sat alone in his study, he realized that his life was changing in ways that he had never imagined. He knew that he had to try and move forward, even though it was painful. He resolved to make the best of his life, and to always remember the love that he had felt for May and for Ellen. Chapter 30. After the Beaufort dinner. It was late at night, and Newland Archer found himself walking alone through the dark streets of New York City. He had just left the Beaufort dinner, where he had been seated next to Olenska. The night had been a painful reminder of their impossible love, as they were surrounded by their peers and the rigid expectations of high society. As Archer walked, he reflected on the strange turn of events that had brought him to this point. He had once thought himself content in his engagement to May Welland, but the arrival of Olenska had shattered his carefully constructed world. He had found himself drawn to her despite their differences in background and the scandal surrounding her separation from her husband. But now, as he walked the dark and lonely streets, Archer was forced to confront the reality of his situation. He knew that his love for Ellen could never be fulfilled, as she was still technically married and their relationship would be met with disapproval and social exile. As Archer walked, he was consumed by a sense of despair and hopelessness. He felt trapped by the expectations of his society, unable to follow his heart and pursue the woman he truly loved. He knew that he would have to continue living his life as a respectable member of New York's elite, conforming to the rules and expectations of those around him. Despite his feelings of hopelessness, Archer was not entirely without hope. He knew that Ellen still held feelings for him, and he could not help but feel a sense of longing and desire whenever he thought of her. He wondered if there was a way for them to be together, to break free of the conventions and expectations that bound them. As he continued to walk, Archer found himself thinking of the future. He wondered what his life would be like if he were to break free of the expectations of his society and follow his heart. He knew that it would be a difficult road, filled with obstacles and challenges, but he also knew that it was the only way he could be truly happy. As the night wore on and the city grew quiet around him, Archer felt a renewed sense of determination. He knew that he could not give up on his love for Ellen, no matter how difficult it might be to pursue. He would find a way to be with her, even if it meant going against the expectations of those around him. With this newfound sense of purpose, Archer continued walking through the dark and empty streets of New York, determined to find a way to be with the woman he loved. Chapter 31. The theater was Lena's. The opening night of the new opera had finally arrived, and Newland Archer and his wife May sat in their box at the Academy of Music, waiting for the curtain to rise. They were surrounded by the cream of New York society, all of whom had come to see and be seen. May was resplendent in a new gown, and Archer couldn't help but notice how much she had grown in confidence since their return from Europe. He was proud of her, but his thoughts kept drifting to the woman he truly desired, the Countess Olenska. As the curtain rose on the first act, Archer couldn't help but be impressed by the grandeur of the production. He knew that the real star of the show, however, was not the opera itself but the singer Lena, who had been brought over from Europe to perform the lead role. The audience was already buzzing with excitement at the prospect of hearing her sing. As Lena made her entrance, the audience erupted into applause. Archer couldn't help but feel a twinge of jealousy as May joined in the applause. He knew that May was the perfect wife, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had settled for her, rather than following his heart. As the opera continued, Archer found himself increasingly distracted. He couldn't focus on the music or the plot, as his thoughts kept drifting to the Countess Olenska. He was torn between his duty to his wife and his desire for the Countess. He couldn't help but wonder what his life would have been like if he had chosen differently. As the final act drew to a close, the audience erupted into applause once again. Archer rose to his feet, applauding politely, but he couldn't shake the feeling of restlessness that had been gnawing at him all night. He knew that he needed to make a decision about his future, but he wasn't sure if he had the courage to follow his heart. As the lights came up and the audience began to file out of the theater, Archer lingered in his box, lost in thought. He knew that he had a choice to make, and that the decision would have far-reaching consequences for all involved. He wondered if he had the strength to make the right choice, or if he would always be held captive by the conventions of New York society. Chapter 32. The Countess Olenska's Carriage. Newland Archer arrived at the Countess Olenska's door, hesitating for a moment before he knocked. The realization that he was about to enter her house as her prospective suitor was overwhelming, and he wasn't sure of how to proceed. As he waited for a response, he examined the exterior of the building. The Countess's carriage was waiting outside, its coachman and footman standing attentively by. The sight of the carriage stirred a pang of jealousy within Archer, as he knew that the Countess would soon be departing with it, likely to meet with another admirer. Finally, the door opened, and the Countess appeared before him, dressed in a simple gown and holding a book. Archer was struck by her natural beauty and grace, and he felt a sudden surge of love and desire for her. They spoke for a while, discussing their future together and the obstacles that stood in their way. The Countess expressed her fear that she would cause Archer to sacrifice too much if they were to be together, and he assured her that he was willing to do whatever it took to make her happy. As they talked, the Countess's carriage remained waiting outside, a symbol of the constraints and expectations of their society. Archer knew that he would have to navigate these obstacles if he wanted to be with the Countess, and he was determined to do so. Eventually, the Countess had to leave, and she retreated to her room to retrieve her cloak. Archer watched as she left, feeling a sense of sadness and longing. He knew that he would have to wait and work for their love to overcome the societal pressures that threatened to keep them apart. As he walked away from the Countess's house, Archer felt a renewed sense of determination. He was determined to win her heart, no matter the cost. He knew that their love was worth fighting for, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to make it a reality. In the carriage, the Countess sat in silence, lost in thought. She knew that her love for Archer was true, but she also knew that they would face many obstacles in their pursuit of happiness. Nevertheless, she was willing to fight for their love, and she was filled with a sense of hope for their future together. As the carriage pulled away, Archer stood watching, filled with a sense of longing and desire. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was willing to face it with the Countess by his side. Together, they would conquer the societal pressures that threatened to keep them apart, and they would emerge victorious in their pursuit of love and happiness. Chapter 33. It was the night of the grand ball at the Beauforts, and everyone who was anyone in New York society was in attendance. The ballroom was decorated in a lavish, ornate style that would have made Louis XIV envious, and the guests were bedecked in their finest attire. Newland Archer arrived with his wife, May, feeling somewhat apprehensive about the evening ahead. He had always found the Beaufort's parties to be rather vulgar, and he had never felt entirely at ease in their company. However, he knew that May was looking forward to the event, so he put on a brave face and tried to enjoy himself. As they made their way through the crowded ballroom, Archer noticed with a sense of relief that the Countess Olenska was not in attendance. He had been growing increasingly anxious about the effect that her presence might have on his relationship with May, and he was glad to be spared that particular awkwardness. However, his relief was short-lived. Just as he was beginning to relax, he heard a murmur of excitement ripple through the crowd, and he turned to see the Countess Olenska making her entrance. She was dressed in a stunning black gown, and her beauty and poise drew every eye in the room. Archer felt a sudden pang of longing and regret as he gazed at her, remembering the intense attraction he had felt for her in the past. He wondered if she still felt the same way about him, and whether there might still be a chance for them to be together. As the night wore on, Archer found himself drawn more and more to the Countess, despite his best efforts to avoid her. He was acutely aware of May's presence, and he knew that any public display of affection between himself and the Countess would be highly inappropriate. However, as the evening drew to a close and the guests began to depart, Archer found himself alone with the Countess in a quiet corner of the ballroom. He felt an intense desire to declare his love for her and to beg her to leave New York with him, but he knew that such an act would be an unforgivable betrayal of his marriage vows. In the end, Archer left the Beaufort ball alone, feeling torn and conflicted. He knew that his feelings for the Countess would never go away, but he also knew that he could never act on them without causing irreparable harm to everyone involved. It was a night of great temptation, and Archer had narrowly avoided succumbing to it. Chapter 34. In the course of the next day. The morning after the Beaufort ball, Newland Archer woke up with a feeling of regret and disillusionment. He had seen Olenska's world, with all its freedom and unconventionality, and had glimpsed the possibility of a different life for himself. But now, in the cold light of day, he was back in his own world, bound by the strictures and expectations of New York society. As he dressed for breakfast, he realized that he had made a mistake in not going to Olenska when she had sent for him. He had been too proud, too concerned with what others might think, and had missed the chance to be with the woman he truly loved. He knew that his marriage to May Welland was a mistake, a decision made for all the wrong reasons, and that he could never be truly happy with her. Over breakfast, May talked excitedly about the previous evening's events, but Newland could barely bring himself to pay attention. He was lost in his thoughts, wondering what he could do to change his situation. He felt trapped, stifled by the conventions of his society and his own sense of duty. After breakfast, Newland went for a walk in the park, hoping to clear his head. As he walked, he saw familiar faces from his world, people he had known his whole life. But now they seemed different to him, somehow smaller and more petty than before. He longed to break free of their expectations and live a life of his own choosing. As he walked, he realized that he had to see Olenska, to tell her how he felt and to try to find a way to be with her. He knew it would be difficult, that he would have to navigate the treacherous waters of New York society and risk everything he had, but he was willing to do it for her. That afternoon, he went to see Olenska at her house. As they talked, he poured out his heart to her, telling her that he loved her and that he was willing to leave his wife and his old life behind to be with her. Ellen was moved by his words, but she knew that it was not that simple. She was still bound by her own obligations and responsibilities, and she knew that a scandal would ruin them both. As they parted, Newland realized that he had no choice but to stay with his wife and to honor the commitments he had made. He knew that it would be difficult, that he would have to sacrifice his own happiness for the sake of his duty, but he also knew that it was the only honorable thing to do. In the course of the next day, Newland Archer returned to his old life, but he was not the same man. He had seen a different world, a world of freedom and possibility, and he knew that he could never be truly happy in his own world. But he also knew that he had made a choice to do what was right, even if it meant sacrificing his own happiness. And in that choice, he found a sense of peace and purpose that he had never known before.
Thank you for listening to Miniature Masterpiece. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more awesome content.